Bonjour tout le monde. Ce n'est pas trop tard. Bonne année. This is our first press conference of 2023 here on Parliament Hill. My name is Elizabeth May. I'm the Member of Parliament for Saanich Gulf Islands and leader of the Green Party of Canada. Je suis fière et très heureuse d'avoir avec moi mes collègues, Monsieur Mike Morrice, député de Kitchener Centre, et aussi Jonathan Pedneault, maintenant le chef adjoint du Parti vert du Canada. Nous avons profité depuis les dernières quelques semaines, quand le Parlement est en pause, nous avons profité d'avoir les rencontres avec les Canadiens de côte à côte. I held community meetings in 8 parts of my small riding. It actually does take a long time to get across my riding, mostly by ferries, and all the way to Newfoundland and Labrador, where my colleague Jonathan Pedneault held a number of meetings with key folks across Newfoundland and Labrador. We then did a tour together for Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, and of course both Mike and Jonathan have spent a lot of time in Quebec lately. The observation that I want to bring to the work that we jointly do on Parliament Hill is that in listening to Canadians, concerns, whether from Vancouver Island or Prince Edward Island, are remarkably similar. Top of mind for Canadians, ce n'est pas en cause de grandes nouvelles. Je pense que tout le monde comprend bien que les enjeux tellement importants pour les citoyens du Canada sont la question de la santé de notre système de santé publique. We have a lot of concerns right across the country about our healthcare system, concerns about affordability, particularly the cost of housing and the availability of housing. There's a lot of concerns about growing gaps between the rich and the poor. And underpinning it all, everywhere you go, Canadians are concerned about the climate crisis. Whether they've just lived through Hurricane Fiona and are still feeling its effects, or whether in British Columbia, the atmospheric rivers of fall of 2021, the heat dome and the fires still feeling those effects. And Canadians from coast to coast want to know that their governments are serious, understand the scale of the problems, and will put aside petty politics and bumper sticker solutions in order to prepare for storms that are coming, whether economic or driven and fueled by our addiction to fossil fuels. I'm going to turn to Mike Morrice for his comments, and Jonathan Pedneault will follow up, and then we'll be available for your questions. Mike.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thank you all for joining us this morning. It's lovely to see you. Thank you for being with us both here in person and online. For my part, as the cost of living increases, my focus will be continuing to be to get support for those in my community in Waterloo Region and in Kitchener and across the country for those who need it most. That starts with persons with disabilities across the country who continue to disproportionately live in poverty. And while we've made progress, and I'm proud of the progress made, both to improve Bill C-22 and to move it forward more quickly to get support to Canadians with disabilities, the fact is that today nothing has changed until the federal government funds the Canada Disability Benefit and begins to deliver it in concert with provinces and territories across the country. And so that effort will continue to see that legislation not only pass in the House and in the Senate, but to get funds delivered as early as budget 2023. Secondly, to ensure that we address the mental health crisis that we continue to be in and provide supports for those who need it most. The governing party has promised the Canada Mental Health Transfer of $4.5 billion. As of my last question to the PM before the holiday break, we've seen no commitment yet to follow through on that, and will continue to apply pressure to work with all parliamentarians who are similarly interested in seeing mental health supports being provided in communities across the country. And of course, to those struggling with the increased unaffordability of housing and the housing crisis that we're in, recognizing that homes need to be places for people to live first and foremost, and not commodities for investors to trade. We need to address the financialization of housing and to propose reasonable solutions to do so. I'll continue to be putting forward solutions along the lines of Motion 71 to ensure that we, in this case, address a tax loophole of one type of corporate investor, real estate investment trusts, and get those funds delivered to affordable housing providers who need it the most. And without a doubt, as Elizabeth has shared already, in the midst of a climate crisis, that we continue to subsidize the very sector most responsible for the crisis that we're in. We could be using those funds to deliver the affordability supports that people need now when they need it most. Thank you all again for being here. I'll pass it to our Deputy Leader, Jonathan Pedneault, to close.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Elizabeth. As you can hear, as you can see, Elizabeth and I have spent quite a bit of time on the road, so has Mike, and throughout this country we've heard from Canadians that they feel pain, that they feel anger, and they feel that in their guts every single day because we live in painful times, in uncertain times, times of crises. Elizabeth and Mike have both named a few of them: a healthcare crisis, an inflation crisis, a housing crisis, an opioid crisis, not to mention, of course, the climate emergency. So in 7 years, we went from the sunny ways to Canada is broken. But both statements are ludicrous. I want to be clear here. Canada is resilient. Canada is not broken. Our politics are. And this is why we have the Green Party. The Green Party is working hard day in and day out to represent Canadians, to listen to their concerns, the things we heard in Newfoundland, the things we heard in Nova Scotia, in the Maritimes, in Ontario. Mike, you were also in the Northwest Territories, highlight very much the state of despair that Canadians feel when it comes to our politics, and we are here to provide an alternative. For many years, we've been fighting for a guaranteed livable income, for concrete solutions to the climate emergency, for a just transition and for a reduction of inequalities. And I look forward to supporting Mike and Elizabeth here as they engage in their parliamentary work. Ça fait déjà plusieurs années que Mike et Elizabeth travaillent durement pour défendre les intérêts des Canadiens. On les a rencontrés, les Canadiens, sur la route à Terre-Neuve, dans les Maritimes. On a entendu partout des histoires similaires, de la colère, de la colère, de la douleur par rapport à la crise des soins de santé, par rapport à la crise du logement. On a des solutions concrètes qu'on est en train d'amener au Parlement. Mike et Elizabeth font un travail extraordinaire pour représenter leur communauté, mais aussi les intérêts de tous les Canadiens. Puis on va continuer à rencontrer les Canadiens partout à travers le pays dans les prochains mois pour vraiment rapporter leur voix au Parlement. C'est ça que le Parti vert fait. C'est ça que le Parti vert souhaite continuer à faire dans les prochains mois. Merci.
Je vais ajouter quelques mots seulement pour réfléchir que nous sommes ici sur le territoire autochtone des peuples algonquins. We're here on the lands of the Algonquin Nation, and that I want to emphasize that the work of COP15, which happened just before the parliamentary break, also underscored globally the critical role of Indigenous sovereignty over lands in the goals of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Impressive achievements, but like our climate promises, not subject to enforcement provisions. So we will continue to work to get Canada to live up to our global promises in solidarity with Indigenous peoples in Canada and globally. Et avec ça, merci. Megwitch, nous sommes disponibles pour les questions en anglais ou en français.
No, yeah, we do have questions. Go ahead.
Okay, I can go if you want. Just simply, maybe Jonathan, can you tell us how soon will you look to seek a seat in Parliament here, and can you just elaborate on how you will look to support these two as they're sitting in the House?
Thanks for the question. For the time being, my focus is on Canadians, on rebuilding our party. I will be traveling throughout the country over the next many months, supporting our members throughout the country to make sure that we have a resilient infrastructure in place in time for the general election. I will not seek a seat before the general election, and when that election is called, I will be running in Quebec, as I've said repeatedly.
Can I ask a question about the war in Ukraine? We've seen the evolution of the Liberals' policy when it comes to lethal aid evolve. We've also seen certainly the NEP move on this. Has the Green Party of Canada's policy in any way changed when it comes to supporting lethal aid, supporting maybe, sending more tanks, maybe even fighter jets?
Thanks, David. I'll take the question very briefly. The Green Party understands the complexity of the situation in Ukraine. I was myself in Ukraine during the first 10 days of the conflict, reported on human rights violations and violations of the laws of war by Russia. Russia has invaded illegally the territory of Ukraine in 2014 and has continued that invasion further and further since last year. It's crucial that Canada not only supports our Ukrainian colleagues and friends, but also seeks to develop strong diplomatic solutions to that crisis. We know that there is no end to this conflict through armed ways. It's crucial that Russia not only stops its invasion and stops any form of violations of the laws of war that is ongoing currently in Ukraine, and we believe that Canada needs to double down on the opening ways, diplomatic channels to try and seek a diplomatic solution.
But do you support sending lethal weapons? Is that something that the Green Party now supports?
The Green Party is a party that believes in peaceful resolution to conflicts. We believe that it would be much more appropriate for Canada to invest in its diplomacy, which has been severely undercut during the Harper years and not quite rebuilt during the Liberal years, despite claims by Prime Minister Trudeau that Canada is back.
You could do that and still send weapons, right?
Just to speak to this, I asked Jonathan to take the first round on that because, of course, he has intimate personal knowledge, as he mentioned, having been in Ukraine at the beginning of the conflict. We also are a party that's global. We are members of the Global Greens. The Minister of Foreign Affairs for Germany, Annalena Baerbock, is former co-leader of the German Green Party. She was co-leader during their election campaign and stepped down, as did Robert Habeck, in order to take positions in the cabinet. The Greens have been going through globally, whether Greens in Sweden, Greens in Finland, where they're in government, and Sweden, where they were recently in government. We also work collegially with global Greens. And there are Greens in Ukraine, the Green Party of Ukraine, as I said in my speech, in response to President Zelensky's speech in Parliament, that extraordinary moment last year. The Greens in Ukraine are begging us to help them have more defenses and even engage in air wars over Ukrainian territory in order to create a no-fly zone. We can't support that. Those measures that are defensive, we will support. We have to stand in solidarity with the peoples of Ukraine, but also and we try to work in coalition with other countries where Greens are in government, and we consult frequently, and for that reason we're not opposing what our government has done thus far. But I can't underscore enough, there are opportunities, I believe, and Greens believe, for diplomatic solutions, particularly for a ceasefire, as soon as possible. And some of those are unexplored. I'll mention one, and it's a problematic political situation right now in Israel, for obvious reasons. But Israel is basically the only democracy ally in the industrialized world that has not done a single thing in terms of sanctions against Russia. Netanyahu is close to Putin. There's an opportunity there, I believe, to put pressure on our ally Israel, to put pressure on their ally Russia in order to open up peace talks. And it was actually President Zelensky who first said, I think it was March of last year, that there should be peace talks. And he then called out to the previous Prime Minister of Israel to offer peace talks in Jerusalem. as a way to see people brought to the table. I mean, Israel's historic connection to Putin is because Israel needs Putin's help to get the butcher of Baghdad, Bashar al-Assad's permission to have Israeli planes flying over Syrian airspace to bomb Hezbollah targets. That's why Israel's close to Putin. But there are a lot of Israeli-Russian joint citizens who fall into the category of oligarchs. Israel should step up in this situation. That's just one example. Where could we?
In Green Party policy, where, you know, previously my understanding was that you opposed lethal aid, but it sounds like you support the measures.
Any measure that is purely in,
that's
right, defensive efforts. But as Jonathan has said, we recognize and we want to
change.
No, it's not a change. We're recognizing very clearly that in this context, this cannot be won militarily. We want a free, democratic, safe Ukraine. That means the war has to stop. We do not believe the war will come to an end through a military victory for either side. We think it's imperative that the killings stop, that the violations of human rights stop, and we think the effort should concentrate less on weapons and more on pushing for peace talks.
I have more questions.
Yeah, you go ahead.
I've got
going.
one, David, I was just hoping to, can you state your position on MAID and whether or not you'll support the government's intention to delay the expansion of it?
I should have mentioned one other thing on our military spending. We are absolutely opposed to buying F-35 fighter jets. And to the extent that the war in Ukraine has made Canadians think, oh, well, perhaps we now need to have more military muscle in our defense budget, those planes represent a massive miscalculation. They are and have been found time and time again to be the wrong plane for Canada's needs and also exorbitantly expensive. And within the U.S. Congress, you increasingly hear voices saying, don't put more money there. To your question on medical assistance in death, and I know that Mike and I have both spoken out on this, we do support an extension as required to ensure that what we're doing is consistent with the very best medical advice and the very best protection of the rights of people who are vulnerable. Do you want to add anything to that, Mike?
If I could just briefly. Yeah, really appreciate the question. And I spoke with the Minister of Justice as recently as yesterday about this to communicate the concerns with respect to expanding MAID more quickly than we seem to be expanding our social safety net, and the importance of prioritizing, for example, the Canada Disability Benefit, for example, mental health supports first and foremost, rather than the continued focus on continuing to expand MAID. Very much encouraged by the support across party lines and the commitment that the minister has made to bring forward legislation to delay the expansion of medical assistance in dying. Thank you.
Can we talk about healthcare? Does the party support, always okay with, you know, outsourcing public healthcare, some procedures to the private sector? Or is that a red line, and do you agree with Jagmeet saying that straight up, no privatization?
I didn't hear Jagmeet Singh say that, but I will reference my speech in the House yesterday on health care, in which I made it abundantly clear that our health care system must be protected. You can find it at the beginning of members' statements at 2 p.m. yesterday. I don't think I left any room for doubt that Green Party of Canada will absolutely reject any creeping privatization. We have too much already. We must defend single-payer, universal health care across Canada through the Canada Health Act. And that means that when provinces step out of line, the federal government has to act. Healthcare is shared jurisdiction between the federal government and the provinces, and undermining our single-payer, universal public healthcare system is very dangerous. We never stopped having those from the moment that the Saskatchewan CCF government won that fight against the doctor's strike, and then almost a decade later we got healthcare across Canada. It's never been something we can take for granted, because the forces for privatization, particularly coming from south of the border, don't give up. And the fact that Canada has a universal single-payer, publicly funded healthcare program for every Canadian has never ceased to be a source of distress, shall we say, for the ideologically rooted south of the border, but it also represents what for us is a sacred trust to deliver health care. For the U.S. for-profit medical system, for the private insurance companies of the United States that run their health care system, we are a market. And under CUSMA, formerly NAFTA, any privatized health care in this country represents a risk, which, by the way, the UK two-tier system doesn't face. There's no neighbor near the UK with the right under a trade deal to bring to a trade tribunal the accusation that the healthcare system is in restraint of trade and unfair. So we run a real risk by allowing any privatization. We run a risk to our whole system. And we see that not as just a red line. There's just what we're seeing right now is already too much. And we have repeatedly called on Federal Health Minister Jean-Yves Duclos to stand up for our public health care system, which means that the posture that the federal government has taken toward provinces on many issues, including climate, should cease being one of, to take some words from Pierre Trudeau, head waiter to the provinces. We're now lead concierge and apologize if we get in their way. The federal government has to step up and protect publicly funded, universal, single-payer health care under the Canada Health Act and expand that to include mental health protections, to include pharmacare. The Greens will never give up on these key goals.
And you support increasing the transfer to $28 billion annually?
Not as a blank check, with clear metrics and deliverables, including focusing on how the healthcare systems are structured. I know we're running out of time, so I'll just throw out this one thought from one of the doctors in my riding. We need to pay attention to the bed-to-bureaucrat ratio. Throwing more money to the provinces has resulted in a proliferation of paperwork, layers and layers of management. It does not increase the health care delivery to individual Canadians. Any other questions?
Finally, just the Ontario Green Party leader, Mike Schreiner, you're seeing that he's being courted
Yes.
by the Ontario Liberals. I'm wondering if you have ever been courted, Madam May, by any of the other parties?
Of course.
Conservatives or Liberals?
Of course.
What advice are you offering to him? Because you've been in that position.
I've been in a position, I won't even bother mentioning what prominent Liberal promised me a cabinet seat if I would leave the Greens. Well, I'm not going to. I made it very clear over and over again to many parties that I was not interested in leaving the Green Party. This is the only party that represents my values. It's the only party that understands the climate crisis. It's the only party that speaks honestly to the threats we face and does so fearlessly. I will say that my advice to Mike Schreiner, Mike and I are very good friends, and sort of like, it seems that we can't have reporters who aren't named David. We can't have great Greens who aren't named Mike. And Mike Schreiner and I share the same birthday. I don't give advice to Mike. He knows I love him. He knows he should take the time it takes, and he knows he needs to make the right decision and have a larger caucus of Green Party members in Queen's Park, because Ontario needs him to fight what Ford is doing to the Greenbelt, to fight for real climate action, to fight against what the Liberals think is adequate climate policy, which is, as Antonio Guterres says, the road to climate hell, foot on the accelerator. That's not Mike's party. That's not my party.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.